Well, Barry, thanks very much for that very kind invitation, and more broadly to you and to the Rajaratnam School for the honour of the invitation to join you for a fortnight as the Rajaratnam Professor. It's an invitation that I take as a great honour. And thank you all for coming here this afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to be in Singapore. As I say, like most Australians, I come to Singapore a lot, but usually for a couple of hours or at best a couple of days. And the chance to spend a couple of weeks here and really participate in the debate and discussion here is one I very much welcome. It gives me a chance to catch up with a lot of old friends, and it gives me a chance to recognise again what a remarkable place Singapore is and what a great place it has in the region. Singapore has a special place for me for two firsts. The first is it was the very first place in the world off the Australian continent that I ever set foot. Like a lot of young Australians, I got on an aeroplane a long time ago, 707, on a school trip and landed in Singapore in January 1968, the first time I'd ever been off the continent. And the impact that it made in all kinds of ways was huge, and it's always stayed with me. And the second, this was the first place I visited as a government official. First time I sat, so to speak, behind the Australian flag and exchanged views with officials of another country. I was a junior intelligence analyst then. I was here on an intelligence exchange. And it was the first opportunity I had to see what one can learn when you sit down and talk to other people about the way they see the region we live in and work in. And of course, I couldn't have had a better introduction to Singapore. I remember being very struck then by how rich and informed and in some ways different the Singaporean perspective on things that we thought we understood very well was. And the impression I had then of professionalism and focus and discipline and so on in the Singaporean system has of course stayed with me ever since. So having this chance to spend some time in Singapore, to talk to a lot of old friends and make some new ones, and to talk to an audience like this is a great privilege, and I really thank you for it. My title, of course, is a little ominous. Peace in our time, that phrase, recalls the awful choices that did so much to shape the history of the 20th century and indeed to shape the world as we know it today. And I suggested it for the title of this talk because I think the choices we face in Asia over the next few years may be just as momentous and the consequences just as serious if we get them wrong as the choices that our parents or grandparents, or in some of our cases great-grandparents, faced back then in the 1930s when they thought about how to respond to what was a very serious series of challenges, linked series of challenges to the global order at the time. Now, I'm conscious that by using that phrase, peace in our time, to summon up those huge and disastrous choices in the 20th century, I risk being slightly melodramatic. And melodramatic is the last thing I want to be. I actually think that drawing an analogy with those choices that countries and governments faced in the 1930s reflects a sober truth, and a very important one, and I hope to explain to you why that's so and what we can do about it. My talk's divided into three parts. The first is I want to explain the risks to peace that are inherent in the current trajectory of the US-China relationship, and particularly the risks to peace and stability in Asia. Secondly, I want to explain how those risks might be minimised. And thirdly, very briefly, I want to explore what that means for the foreign policies and strategic policies of countries like Australia and Singapore. So, part one, the risks in Asia. I want to persuade you that we can't take peace in Asia for granted in future, the way we have for so long. And to understand why we can't take it for granted, we need to look back and ask why we have been able to take it for granted for a very long time. I think that two factors have been vital in providing the peace and stability in Asia for, I think in particular, the last 40 years, which has done so much to create the Asia we have today, the Asia of, as Barry said, the Asian century. And therefore do so much to shape our perceptions of what might come in the future. The first is, so to speak, the raw fact of American primacy. That is, of American power, economic power, military power, diplomatic power, soft power, and so on, that whole collection of American power, and the fact that the United States committed that power to sustaining a very stable order in Asia. That has been central. But the second factor, which has been central to the peace and stability of the last 40 years, has been that America's position in Asia as the leading power has been uncontested by any other major power. It's been contested by little powers, relatively little powers like North Korea, but it has not been contested by any of the powers that were strong enough to really make a difference to the way the region as a whole worked. And that has been true in particular since 1972, because in 1972, 40 years ago last year, when Nixon went to China, the United States and China built a new kind of relationship in which China ceased to contest American primacy as the foundation for the Asian order. In fact, it accepted American primacy as the foundation for the Asian order and accepted American primacy as the foundation for the US-China relationship. And the stable relationships between the region's most powerful states that resulted from that, between China and the United States, but also between China and Japan and the United States, that has been so fundamental to the way the region has evolved since then, so fundamental to everything the region's achieved, that we're in danger of forgetting how important it was. We take it for granted. Joseph Nye, back in the 1990s, when he was in government for a while, talked about how security is like oxygen. You don't notice if it's not there. Well, the heart of the oxygen he was talking about was that stable, uncontested relationship between the region's most powerful states, which was the necessary foundation for all the wonderful things that have been achieved in Asia in the intervening decades. And not least, of course, for countries like Singapore, for the Southeast Asian region, the evolution of ASEAN, for Australia and the way Australia's been able to develop its relations with the region. All of these have been fundamentally shaped by the fact that we were dealing with a region in which the great powers weren't contesting with one another, which made it extremely easy for us to work with one another. But also, of course, for China, because China's decision to accept American primacy as the foundation of the Asian order opened the door to China doing everything that it's done since then. It needed to be able to work with America. It needed to be able to get access to American capital, American markets, American technology, American management expertise, and, of course, the global economic system which lay behind it. And just to be absolutely clear, because I'm going to talk about the end of that era, I wish it wasn't ending. I do think uncontested American primacy has produced a golden age for Asia and a golden age for Australia, and if I had my way, it would last forever. But it won't. Today, America's power remains immense, but its primacy in Asia is no longer uncontested. China's leaders back in 1972, when they did that deal with Nixon, probably always hoped and expected that a time would come when China would be able to revisit that decision. It would no longer need to acquiesce in US primacy, would no longer need to accept the subordination to America that that position implied. I don't think they ever liked it. I think they made a very shrewd and sensible and correct decision that it was in China's interests to accept it. But I think they always recognised that this was a means to an end, not an end in itself. They probably didn't expect that they would get to the point so quickly that they could shake American primacy off. They probably didn't expect that China would grow so fast as to be in a position to revisit its acquiescence in US primacy as quickly as it has. But China is now poised to overtake the United States as the world's largest economy, at least on PPP terms, which in the strategic business is the most relevant measure. And the approach that China adopted to managing its future relations with the US early in that process, what people call the bide and hide strategy, bide its time and hide its power, to avoid raising concerns. Very recently, I would say in 2009, the Chinese abandoned the bide and hide strategy and have been willing to make their challenge to American primacy much clearer. So that primacy, the challenge to US primacy as the basis for Asian order, is now overt and very significant. We don't know what China wants instead. We know that China no longer accepts US primacy as a foundation for the Asian order. We don't know what it wants instead, and it won't say, and that's a problem in itself. But I think there's a few judgments we can make about what it might mean, what the kinds of things that the Chinese probably have in mind. The first point to make is I don't think there's any reason to expect that China wants to fundamentally change the way Asia works. China is in that respect rather different from a lot of other new rising powers. Normally what happens when you look back at the historical examples is that a rising power challenging a status quo wants to make really fundamental changes to the way the region works. If you think, for example, of the kind of challenge that Japan posed to the regional order in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, it wanted to fundamentally change the way Asia worked, destroy the colonial system, fundamentally reorient the region's economic structures and so on. If you look at the ambitions that the Soviet Union had as a challenging power during the Cold War, it wanted to fundamentally change the global order, fundamentally change the internal politics of a whole lot of states and so on. China, I don't think, is nearly that revisionist. And in particular, I think China realises that Asia works very well for it today. So I don't think it's any part of China's ambition as it contests the old US-based order that it wants to do anything that fundamental to Asia. It likes the way the region works at the moment. It just wants to have a bigger leadership role. This might seem a trite metaphor, but I think it doesn't mind the bus that we're all riding in. It doesn't even mind the destination we're heading towards. It just wants to be in the driving seat. Now, many people nonetheless doubt that China really is committed to contesting the Asian order. They believe that China either cannot or will not sustain a challenge to US primacy. And I've spent a lot of time talking about this with many people around the world, and I find that the arguments that are put forward to dispute the argument I'm making that China is fundamentally challenging American primacy fall into four categories. And in the spirit of kind of sinological numerology, I call them the four denials. And they form together a kind of an interlocking system of ideas which mutually reinforce one another and reassure people, those who believe in them, that nothing fundamentally is changing in Asia strategically and politically, even if some very big changes are happening economically. And the four denials are, first is that China's not really growing economically, or maybe that it has been growing economically, but that its economy will sag, and that the extraordinary rise in China's economic weight, which I'm arguing is the foundation for its challenge to American primacy, will disappear or dwindle. The second denial is that, okay, maybe China's economy will keep growing, but it won't manage to build the political and strategic and particularly the military weight required to translate its economic power into strategic weight to challenge American primacy. And the third denial is, maybe China will develop the political and strategic weight, but it won't choose to use it to challenge American primacy because American primacy serves China so well. China, in a sense, can't afford to undermine American primacy. And the fourth is, well, maybe China will choose to challenge, but it doesn't matter because we'll win. Now, these are all credible propositions. There are significant debates to be had in relation to all of them. But I think my argument is that each of them is on balance much more likely to be wrong than right. And I just want to very quickly explain why. I'm going to cover a bit of ground very quickly here. So forgive me for being a little bit superficial in some of these. Very happy to explore these issues more further later if people wish. The first is that, of course, China's economy might slow or stop growing. But I think it's by far and away the most likely thing is that China's economy will, on balance and in the long run, and remember it's the long run, it's the decade spans that really matter here, China's economy is most likely to keep growing faster than the United States, and so the shift in relative economic weight will continue, though not as fast as it has. But the second point is that the proposition that China's economic weight has increased to the point where the relative strategic power of the two countries is such that the United States can no longer sustain primacy on the old basis. That prediction about China's economic trajectory, that proposition about China's economic trajectory is not a prediction. It's already happened. China is already, today, larger relative to the United States economically than any country has ever been for over 100 years. It's larger relative to the United States economically than the Soviet Union ever was during the Cold War. It is therefore on this most fundamental measure of national power, most fundamental source of national power, already the most formidable country the United States has ever had to deal with. So even if China's economy stopped growing today and flatlined for decades, which it won't do, it would already be strong enough to make the Asian order that was based on US primacy erected in 1972 unsustainable. And of course, even on quite moderate estimates of China's economy and quite optimistic projections of America's economy, the Chinese economy doesn't stop when it overtakes America's, as it could easily do within a few years. There's a serious chance that it will be double the size of America's before the middle of the decade, before the middle of the century. That, to me, is almost unimaginable, but this is not a possibility we can afford to overlook. After all, it would have been unimaginable if 20 years ago somebody told you that China would overtake the US economy as early as the middle or towards the end of this decade. Now, one last point I need to make about that. None of this is an argument about American decline. The shift in relative economic weight between the United States and China is a product of China's achievement, not of America's failure. I'm one of those who believes that America's economy remains a phenomenally powerful, flexible, impressive, adaptable, and durable instrument. The United States will remain a phenomenally rich and powerful country for as far ahead as anybody can see. It just won't be the world's richest country, and the reason for that is simple arithmetic. It's the power of an immense population. America has been the world's richest country since the 1880s, simply because it's had the largest workforce, which has enjoyed the benefits of modern industrial levels of per capita productivity. And the reason for that is that it's had such a big population, today the third biggest population in the world, and the only countries who've got a chance of overtaking it are the two with populations bigger than America. China's population, workforce, roughly speaking, 4 times the size of America's. To overtake the United States per capita productivity in China only needs to be a quarter what it is in the United States. To double America's economy, it only needs to be a half of per capita productivity in the United States. This is not an unthinkable outcome. So I think we need to take China's economic growth and the strategic implications of it very much for real. The second denial is that, okay, China might do all that economically, but it won't manage to convert it into to the military and diplomatic capacity to challenge America's strategic primacy. And there's a lot in that. Obviously, the United States is much more than just an economy. It has huge military resources, an immense diplomatic weight, great deal of soft power, and so on. Again, this is a big topic. Let me cover it very quickly. There are two reasons why I think this denial doesn't work. The first is that the competition between the US and China is not symmetrical. If it was a straight fight or a straight competition, then the United States would win it. But in fact, the strategic competition between the US and China for primacy in Asia, not globally, but in Asia, is very asymmetrical, and all the asymmetries cut China's way. The first is that China is focused on Asia, and the United States has global commitments and global interests, and for all of the rebalancing, we'll still have a lot of other things to do. China can focus its efforts close to home. The second is the sphere of competition on which they focus happens to be very close to China and a long way from the United States. So China has all the advantages of competing in its own backyard. The third is that in purely military terms, what China needs to do in order to undermine the military foundations of US primacy is simply to deny the United States the capacity to project power by the Western Pacific. And that is a much easier task militarily than what the United States has to do to resist that, which is to deny China the capacity, to deny the United States the capacity to project power by sea. It's the difference between sea control and sea denial in naval strategic terms, and all of the advantages, operational and tactical and technical, in that kind of situation cut China's way. And finally, and a very significant advantage for China, there's an asymmetry of motivation. Asia is terribly important to America, but is much more important to China. And in the end, China will be prepared to pay more and lose more to achieve its objectives in Asia than the United States will, or rather, the Chinese will believe that. And that's very important. The third denial is that, okay, well, China will have the capacity maybe, but it won't use it because it needs peace and stability to grow. And the argument's very familiar, that if you're a Chinese leader, you're focused on hanging on to power. Hang on to power means keeping the economy growing. Keeping the economy growing means maintaining a peaceful and stable region. And the US primacy is the necessary condition for a peaceful and stable region, therefore China won't challenge US primacy. That assumes that the Chinese see the conditions for peace and stability in Asia the same way we do. That is, it assumes that the Chinese agree with us that US primacy is the only imaginable foundation for peace and stability in Asia. And I'm here to tell you I don't think the Chinese think that. I think it's very easy for the Chinese to imagine a very stable order in Asia which does not depend on US primacy. One that depends on Chinese primacy might work, for example. And I think that the Chinese do, in fact, believe not just that a Chinese-led Asia would be as stable as a US-led Asia, but that it would be more congenial to China, and particularly more congenial to China if, or I should say as, the United States starts, as the Chinese, I think, rightly fear it's starting to do, the United States starts to use its primacy not to promote China's opportunities, as it has since 1972, but to constrain them because of its fear of China's growing power. The second reason I think why we'd be mistaken to assume that China's would hold back from contesting American primacy because it can't afford to do so, is that it presupposes that economics is all that's driving the decision makers. It presupposes that the Chinese leaders simply think that in order to hang on to power, they need to keep growing China's economy. They certainly need to do that. That's certainly necessary. I don't think it's sufficient, because I don't think Chinese voters, if I can put that in inverted commas, any more than any other voters around the world, only think of economics when they think about their country. In particular, I think the Chinese government must respond to very deep feelings within China, within the Chinese people, that as their country grows strong again, it should grow, it should be seen as a leader, it should be respected. This is a very big question. It goes right to the heart of the issue. I do think that we'd be very unwise not to expect the Chinese people to have very deep motivations for China to take a proper place, a leading place in Asia as its power grows. In the end, that's simply a reflection, that's nothing special about China. It's simply a reflection of the fact that the Chinese people, like people everywhere, to a remarkably high degree, identify with their country, as people do, and the Chinese people in particular see their country as being very special. In fact, they think about their country very much the way I think Americans think about their country. And that equally drives the imperatives that must shape the way governments respond to these things. And the fourth denial is that it doesn't matter because China can't win. I think that's a big mistake. Or rather, I'll put it the other way. I don't think China can win a sustained strategic competition with the United States, but neither can the United States. China is too strong. I think when Americans think about escalating strategic rivalry with China, I think when a lot of the rest of us think about escalating strategic rivalry between the US and China, we think back to the Soviet Union. And it's easy to say, well, the United States beat the Soviet Union, so if the Chinese are dumb enough to try this, what's the problem? We'll see them off. Well, China's not the Soviet Union in a million ways. and none of those ways is more important than the fact that its economy works. This is the biggest shift in the distribution of wealth in 200 years, and that really does affect what the United States can achieve. So if I'm right that the denials are wrong, if I'm right then that the Chinese challenge is something the United States has to take very seriously, the question is, how does the US respond? And of course, for a long time it didn't respond. For a long time it hardly noticed. There was a post-Cold War euphoria, which everyone thought the United States was going to rule the world forever. There was a post-9/11 paranoia, in which we just forgot about Asia, forgot about everything that was happening in the world except for the areas where Al-Qaeda was to be found, putatively. And of course, China encouraged the United States in this with bide and hide. But then more recently, the United States has started to think about, recognise the scale of the challenge. And has, in doing that, I think has continued to approach, even as it's recognised the fact that China's challenge might be emerging, has continued to focus its policies, or its approaches on policies which assume that the decision has not yet been made. We talk a lot about shaping and hedging. We're trying to shape China's decisions and hedge against the possibility that it takes the wrong decision. Dissuade China from challenging American primacy and hedge against the possibility that it might nonetheless make that choice. But of course, shaping and hedging presuppose that the choice hasn't already been made. My argument is that the choice has already been made, that it's too late to shape and hedge. We now have to respond. And I think the historians will judge that that's what Obama judged, that's what Obama decided in 2009. And in 2009, not just did we see, as I mentioned before, a starker Chinese assertion of its challenge, but a much starker US response to it. We see this in the pivot, rebalancing, whatever you like to call it, which is, it's worth saying, fundamentally a strengthening of the US position in Asia, military, diplomatic, alliances, economic relationships, to strengthen US position to resist China's challenge to American primacy, to perpetuate American primacy. And Obama spelled all this out, I think, very clearly, very starkly, in a speech he gave, in fact, in Canberra in November 2011. Now, there's a lot of questions about whether the pivot actually means much in operational terms, but I think it means a great deal in political and strategic terms, because it does, I think, unambiguously commit the United States to respond to to China's challenge, now that challenge has become more clear, by resisting it, by saying, no, we're not going to compromise on American primacy as the foundation for the Asian order. We're going to seek to retain US primacy as a foundation of the Asian order for as far ahead as we can see, and, to use the phrase that Obama used in his speech, use all the instruments of American power to do so. Now, I think this is, in effect, a containment strategy. US policymakers don't like it being called a containment strategy. But I think it only makes sense to deny that the policy set out by Obama and implemented since then is containment if you deny that the Chinese are actually challenging. Once you accept that the Chinese are challenging, then I think it's very clear that the US response to that challenge is to attempt to contain it, very much, in fact, the way it tried to contain the Soviet Union. But it won't work. And the reason it won't work is that that approach, simply stiff-arming China, simply saying, no, we're not going to compromise. We are going to aim to preserve the status quo in the face of your challenge, only leads to a good outcome if China decides to back off. Only works for America if the Chinese say, oh, sorry, didn't realise you cared. If you don't want us to challenge your primacy, we won't, and we'll accept American primacy as a foundation for the Asian order indefinitely. And of course the Chinese aren't going to do that. They haven't done it. In fact, they've done just the opposite. They've called America's bluff and they've pushed back. They have tested whether the United States is really willing to use all the instruments of its power to resist Chinese attempts to expand its power and influence in the Western Pacific, and they've tested it quite specifically in the South China Sea, and particularly the transactions over the Scarborough Shoals last year, and they're testing it right now in the East China Sea and the Senkakus. And here's the risk. The US and China have fundamentally incompatible views of the Asian order and their role in it. China really does seek to change, to replace the order based on US primacy, to replace it with something in which they at least play a much bigger role. The United States is determined to preserve that as the foundation of the Asian order. Both seek to impose their views on the other. And this is promoting escalating strategic rivalry and a steadily increasing risk that that rivalry will produce a war between them. And the situation of the Senkakus right now shows exactly how that could happen. Now, I don't want to be too melodramatic. Neither side wants a war, of course. But to imagine that neither side wants a war means the war's not going to happen is to misunderstand how wars start. Wars don't start because one side or the other thinks it's usually don't start because one side or the other thinks it's a great idea. They start when both sides face a choice between war and some alternative that seems even worse than going to war. And they're pushed towards that choice, choosing war in that situation, when they assume that the other side will either lose quickly or back down. And the US and China today are both at real risk of putting one another in the position that the only alternative to war between them is to accept the other's view of Asia's future order, which entails them accepting a significant degradation, reduction in their own status and aspirations, accept humiliation, if you like, and both to easily assume that the other will back down. So I do think the risk of rivalry between the United States escalating to the point where there's a conflict between them is much higher than most people believe and is much closer than most people believe. And of course, war has a logic of its own. If fighting broke out, I don't know how it would unfold, but we can't assume it wouldn't escalate. In fact, I think the pressures to escalation in a naval conflict between the US and China are very strong, and we can't assume it wouldn't escalate across the nuclear threshold. This is a very big subject in itself, but I think the risk of nuclear escalation in a war between the US and China is really quite high because the threshold for nuclear use on both sides is both low and very unclear. And it is just very important to vividly imagine how catastrophic, even if it didn't cross the nuclear threshold, how catastrophic a US-China war would be for the whole region. Start by imagining what happens to US-China economic relationships and what happens, therefore, to the global and particularly the regional economy, including for countries like Singapore and Australia. This is a very serious question. So, how do we get out of it? My second section, it'll be quicker. How we get out of this depends, of course, primarily on what the US and China choose to do. And so, to get out of this risk of rivalry and war that seems to be escalating, we've got to ask ourselves, what choices, what else can they do? What other choices could they make to limit this risk? Well, let's start with the US. What else could the US do? Well, one possibility is that it could withdraw from Asia and leave Asia to China. Most people think this is out of the question because most people have heard countless speeches by senior US officials saying that the United States is an Asian power and here to stay. And of course they mean it when they say it. But when they say it, they mean the United States will stay, wants to stay as the region's uncontested primary power. And as long as American primacy is uncontested, it will stay because uncontested primacy is a bargain. Anyone would want that. That's not the question. The question is, if its primacy is contested in Asia, will the United States stay to pay the costs and risks of meeting that contest? And I don't think we can assume that it can. It could be that the United States, once it found that it can't win that contest with China, believes that we're better off to withdraw from Asia rather than to keep competing with China. And that's not a great option for America. It still carries lots of risks. And of course it carries huge risk for us, the rest of us who are left behind on this side of the Pacific, because that would mean we either had to accept Chinese primacy as the new Asian order or resist it without American support, neither of which is appealing. So I think we do have to take the possibility of US withdrawal, not this year or next year, and not suddenly overnight, but a US facing the challenge from China, choosing to step back, is a significant possibility that we can't overlook. But there is a third option, not contesting China's challenge and pushing back to maintain primacy, and not withdrawing and leaving the field to China. There's a third option, which is neither the status quo of US primacy nor the acquiescence in Chinese primacy, but finding a new kind of relationship with China as a foundation of a new order in Asia in which both the US and China play leading roles. But both of them play roles different from the roles they've played in the past and different from the roles they hope to play in the future. The US still plays a big role in Asia, but smaller than it's played. China plays a bigger role, but smaller than it wants to play. They share power and leadership. In doing that, we avoid the risks that would go with China's hegemony, because America remains in Asia to constrain and limit China's exercise of power. But we also avoid the risks of escalating rivalry. And I've got to say, I think this outcome is by far and away the best. It's a choice between America and China having an ongoing and escalating rivalry over primacy, or the US stepping back and leaving Asia in China's hands. I think that option, the power sharing option, is by far and away the most attractive for both the US and China, but also for the rest of us. But it's incredibly hard. I think it's the best outcome, but it's very, very problematic. Power sharing is a very difficult thing to do. It's very difficult for both the main players, because both sides have to fundamentally change the way they see one another, and they have to fundamentally change the way they see themselves. China will have to accept that the US will continue to play a big role in Asia. China will have to accept, for this model to work, that for all its strength and all its progress, it can't lead Asia the way America has done. And it just has to, and to do that, it has to see what is, I think, true. That for all of China's extraordinary power, and I've emphasised how great I think it's going to be, it's still going to be relatively less powerful relative to other countries in the international system than America has been at the time of American primacy. Even in Asia, the United States is going to face other very formidable powers like Japan, like India, and so on. And it's very important that China understands that. China will in fact face a very difficult choice. It'll have to abandon hopes to lead Asia and accept that the US will stay a key player, or take the US and the rest of the region on as rivals, which China can't win. It's a very difficult choice for China to make. And the key question, of course, is China willing to make that choice? How far is it willing to step back from its aspirations to lead Asia itself and accept that much lesser objective of a shared leadership? Well, I think it's possible. My bet is that China will not accept the status quo of US primacy, but it might accept that kind of power sharing if it's on offer. It might accept it if the United States is prepared to accept it. So that brings us to US choices. The choice about the United States faces about how it responds to China's challenge in Asia, I think, is the most important choice the United States has faced since the Cold War. And it may well be as important as any the United States has ever faced in its national history. The question is whether it's willing to stay in Asia, not to dominate or lead the region, but to share power with China and balance it. If I'm right about China's bottom line, that means the United States will have to treat China as an equal. Treat China as an equal. And really treat China as an equal. Sometimes Americans say that that's what they do at the moment. They say that they want China to play a bigger role and so on. I don't think that's right, or at least what Americans think treating China as an equal might be like is not what the Chinese mean, and it's what the Chinese mean that matters in this context. It doesn't mean just inviting China to do more to support US decisions as a responsible stakeholder in a US-led order. It means really sharing leadership and decision-making. And the United States has never done that before. The United States has never had that kind of relationship with another power. It's contrary to the very deepest conceptions of America's place in the world, to exceptionalism, if you like. But of course there's a reason for that. That is, the United States has never faced a country as powerful as it is before. The United States has to build a new kind of relationship with China, different from the relationship that is built with other countries in the past, because China is a new kind of partner, a new kind of international engagement for America. And it's worth bearing in mind that America has actually, it's never done it, but it's contemplated doing it before. In 1919, at the Treaty of Versailles, the United States, or at least the US negotiators and President Wilson, walked up to the idea of the United States functioning within the League of Nations on a basis of equality with other members of the League. In the end, the US Senate wouldn't buy it. In 1945, they contemplated doing it in the Security Council as one of the permanent members of the Security Council. And indeed, FDR's whole conception of the post-Second World War era, a conception of the four policemen, as he called it, was the idea that the United States and the other four great powers, as he saw them then, Britain, the Soviet Union and China, would share power at the global level. So America's thought about this before. It's just never actually found itself in the position of having to do it. And it certainly hasn't found itself in the position of having to do it with a country like China, whose political system and its values are so alien, and whom Americans would find it so hard to trust. And this question of trust is really critical. There is a lot of bad history out there. And in particular, people, when they think about this idea of whether or not one should trust a rising power, negotiate with it to share power in this kind of way, particularly people think back to the moment where Chamberlain talked about peace in our time. They go back to appeasement. They go back to Germany and Japan in the 1930s. And they say, look, the lesson of the 1930s was that you never accommodate ambitious powers. You never try and meet them halfway. The only way to respond to ambitious powers who are trying to change the international order in their interests is to resist any change whatsoever. And of course, what people assume in that is that if you just keep saying no, eventually the other guy will go away. Eventually the other guy will accept it and back down. And a lot of people, when they talk about what happened in 1938 with Hitler, assume that that's what would have happened. If Chamberlain had only stood up to Hitler, the Germans would have gone away. Well, maybe the Germans would have gone away in 1938. But I don't think we can assume that China goes away. But it's also, there's a deeper question as to whether that's the right way to think about this question. Because to apply the lesson of appeasement, apply the lesson of 1938 to the choices we face today about China, assumes that China is in effect Nazi Germany. It assumes that it can't be satisfied, it can't be trusted to make a deal and stick to it. And that might be right. It might be right that China ends up being insatiable and we can't deal with it in these terms. But we haven't tested that. We haven't tested that. It's too easy just to assume that China is going to be like Nazi Germany. But if we assume that without testing it, without doing everything we can to find out if it's possible, then we risk, and by not testing it, we simply decide to push and give China no space at all, then we risk committing ourselves to these immense costs and risks without needing to. Maybe China is determined to dominate Asia in ways which are incompatible with our deepest interests and values. And if so, it will have to be resisted at terrible cost. But if we assume it is before we've explored the alternatives, we can condemn ourselves to pay huge costs when it might not be necessary. All of this means that as the US chooses how to respond to China, it must clearly recognise how much is at stake, both in terms of China's power and its ambitions, and the risks of rivalry and war that flow from an attempt to resist them absolutely. And I must say, I don't think it's clear that the United States has yet done this. Now, some people hope that both the United States and China can be spared making these terribly difficult choices that I've described, that they can simply drift into the kind of power-sharing agreement that I'm talking about without really choosing to do so. And the problem, of course, is for an American president or a Chinese president to stand up and say, we're going to share power with those other guys. It's a terribly difficult thing to do. So maybe if you could just let it happen without talking about it, it would all be easier. And a lot of people, including some very important people, I think actually in some respects, Henry Kissinger in his On China book a couple of years ago, I think was grasping after this model. And I wish that was true, because it would be much easier. It's a very attractive idea. But the trouble is the drift is all the other way. Without very clear leadership it's much less likely that the US-China relationship will drift towards accommodation than that it will continue as it is now, drifting towards escalating rivalry. And time is not on our side. The longer we go before the US and China can reach a clear understanding about their future relationship, the greater the risk that something like the Senkakus, and if the Senkakus issue blows over, there'll be something else just like it later this year, and another thing early next year, and another thing later next year, and eventually one will go bad on us, and we'll be in terrible trouble. So I do think we can't just afford to let the statesmen and women off the hook and let them drift towards this, because that's not the direction we're drifting. Well, the last question to ask is, what does this look like? Okay, I've said that we should encourage our statesmen and politicians, US and China, to move towards this power sharing deal. But what does it look like? Well, we don't know. I don't know what it looks like. And in the end, what it looks like will emerge from a negotiation between them. And that negotiation will be very hard. The United States will need to give away more than it wants, and so will China. And one of the key questions is, where do you stop? Where does the US, for example, stop accommodating? At what point do you say, no, we're not prepared to go that far. You've asked for too much. There must be such a point. But that point has to be recognised as the point at which the costs of conceding something to China exceeds the costs of escalating strategic rivalry and a high risk of war. And so I'd set that threshold pretty low. I think we should be quite open-minded about what the outcome might be. It's going to be a very different order. It's not going to be nice as the one we've known. It won't look like the old one. But we must focus very heavily on trying to make sure that this is peaceful as can be. And of course, so far I've just talked about the US and China, but you may have noticed there are other countries in the region. And in particular, there are other great powers. I think the really critical point is that there are other powers in Asia big enough to upset a US-China agreement if they don't like it. In other words, they have a veto. These are the other great powers. That's what makes a great power. And they have to be brought into the deal as well, also treated as equals. Japan, I think, is the most obvious case. India, I think, may well be. Perhaps a few decades from now, Indonesia would be. But this is not then just a bilateral deal. It's a deal that has to include 4 or maybe 5 players. And how does that work? Well, this looks really hard. But there are some examples of just this kind of deal. They're called concerts of power. They're very rare in international affairs, but not unknown. At the heart of a concert of power is an agreement between a group of powers to respect each other as one another's status as a great power, and none of them seek to dominate the others. And it's enforced not just by good fellowship, but by a sense that if any power tries to break that deal, it will meet the combined opposition of the others and will fail. And the best example of this is a concert of Europe in the 19th century. Now, there's nothing riskier, particularly for an Australian, to try and use European examples for Asian strategic issues. But I don't push this one too far. It's not a model, it's not a blueprint or a template. It's simply a historical suggestion, an example of how a system like this could work. And of course, it's easy to say, how would it looks incredibly risky, and it is. It's very hard to see how it could work, very hard to see how it could be brought into being. I think it probably won't happen. I don't predict that we'll end up with something that looks like a concert of Asia, because it's so hard to do. I think it's more likely we'll end up with escalating strategic rivalry. But I think it's worth a try, because, so to speak, the only thing that makes the idea of trying to build a concert even remotely credible is the consequences of the alternatives are so bad. And if people can understand those alternatives, understand how bad they are, they might be prepared to take the steps necessary to make it happen. Well, very quickly, let me conclude by saying what I think this means for Australia and Singapore. I think this is, for both of us and for our neighbours, the biggest issue certainly that the region has faced since the end of the Vietnam War, and perhaps the biggest issue that we've faced since the end of the Pacific War, and in a sense since each of us emerged as independent players in the regional order. And how it works out is going to be absolutely fundamental to our well-being. What do we want out of it? Because Australia and Singapore look at this situation, and for that matter our neighbours, what do we want? I actually think there's a very broad and very deep consensus agreement between us. Nobody in Asia wants to live under China's shadow. And everybody recognises the best way of avoiding that is for the United States to stay actively engaged in Asia. So everybody wants the US to stay engaged. But nobody wants to live with the consequences of escalating strategic rivalry between the United States. Certainly nobody wants to live with the outcome of a US-China war. So we all want the United States to stay engaged in Asia. We want the US to stay engaged in a way that avoids those risks. And that means, in the end, in a way that is acceptable to China. Now, maybe there isn't such a way. Maybe the Chinese won't make the choice I described before. But the outcome that works for us is the one in which the United States stays engaged, but in a way that China is willing to accept. In other words, the kind of model that I've tried to describe. The question is not whether we want the United States to stay, but what form of role the United States plays and how it can be negotiated. And that will require us to accept changes in international order, which we'd much rather not accept. But we don't have much choice. In Australia, political leaders have a slogan. We don't have to choose between a good relationship with the United States and a good relationship with China. But when they say that, what they mean is that we don't want to choose between the US and China. So it's very important to distinguish between policies and wishes. We don't want to choose. And that's right, we don't want to choose. There's no good future for Australia in which we don't have a very strong relationship with both countries. But whether we have to choose or not doesn't depend on us. It's not an Australian decision whether we have to make that choice. It's up to the US and China whether Australia has to make that choice. The sharper their rivalry, the sharper and starker the choices Australia has to make. And there is, I would argue, a real risk that we'll be forced into making very stark choices indeed. And you could say that we have already started to make those choices. Australia's decision, for example, to welcome US forces in Darwin as part of the pivot was a choice to support the United States in resisting China's challenge. A very significant decision, in my opinion. So the real choice we face in Australia is not whether we choose between the US and China, but whether we do anything to make it less likely that we'll be forced to make such choices in future by escalating strategic rivalry between the two of them. So what can we do to make that less likely? Well, if my analysis is right, the best and only thing we can do is to try to engage the US and China towards an accommodation, if possible, to try and encourage them both in that direction. First, of course, to avoid things that push them the other way. To avoid, for example, policy steps which encourage the United States to resist any accommodation with China. And I think Australia's policy on Darwin falls into that category. But more positively, to engage both of them in frank debate about those issues that are so important to us. In Australia's case, that conversation, I guess, should happen especially with the United States and Singapore too, because Singapore has immense credibility in DC. It's very easy to underestimate our capacity to influence American opinion on this issue. A lot of people say, oh, how could we possibly tell the United States what to do? Well, we can't tell them what to do. But the United States is a very open system, very open to ideas, very open to argument. Lee Kuan Yew himself has demonstrated on many occasions just how a very strong argument conveyed with great clarity and precision can sway US policy on really significant issues. I think we're already seeing Singapore leaders start to articulate some of those things. I think your PM gave a speech at the Central Party School in Beijing last year, which had some very important lines in it. It'd be great to see him give that speech in DC as well, if I can put it that way. In Australia, the government's been a bit slower, but some of our leading political figures have had significant things to say. Kevin Rudd, a very complex and important figure in Australian politics, has been saying some very important things about the idea of Asia's future being not a Pax Americana or a Pax Sinaica, but a Pax Pacifica. He wouldn't necessarily agree with what I'm about to say, but I think Kevin Rudd and I are quite close there. And Malcolm Turnbull, very significant figure on the other side of politics, has moved that way. So I think there's a chance that our countries can start to develop within our own societies a discussion about this and start to participate in the discussion with the US and with China about these things. And I think it's very important that we do so. It's very different from the sort of thing a lot of us have done in foreign policy before. But I think we have to understand we need a new concept of foreign policy. We are at the moment living through the biggest shift in the distribution of material power in the globe in 200 years, and therefore the biggest shift in the distribution of strategic power. That has huge implications for the international order, particularly in Asia, and therefore huge implications for the kind of world that our countries live in and how we work in them. I think it's the biggest shift, certainly in Australia's history. European settlement 234 years ago, 5 years ago this year. We have generally been blessed with very stable international environments. We're now facing an era in which there are some challenges of a scale we haven't faced. And I think we're going to have to take a different, more active, more energetic approach to how we protect our interests in the evolution of that order than we have before. Let me end with a quote which appears at the start of the executive summary of the US government's recent Global Trends 2030 report. And it is a testament to the openness of the US government that they publish such a document, and a document of such high quality. But it's a quote from Keynes, J.M. Keynes, which is, "The idea of the future being different from the present is so repugnant to our conventional modes of thought and behaviour that we, most of us, offer a great resistance to acting on it in practice." I think that perfectly reflects the problem we all face in addressing the really fundamental challenges that we're living through at the moment. And I think it's very important we overcome them. Thank you very much.